Stonehenge. For a long time, the world has viewed it as a mysterious ring of ancient stones, thousands of years in the making. People have described it as a temple, an observatory, a sacred site for worship. But what if the reality is far greater than any of that? What if it is not merely a stone monument, but the heart of a much larger, concealed system? In 2026, when 3 centuries worth of surveys, measurements, maps, and historical records were examined together through artificial intelligence analysis, the picture that emerged was nothing like the one we had always accepted. What came to light did not simply revise one theory, it fundamentally transformed the way humanity looks at Stonehenge. This was not speculation built from nothing, but a reconstruction grounded in data. And the most astonishing part was that the true mystery did not live only in those upright stones, but was buried across the entire surrounding landscape. In the soil, in distant markings scattered far and wide, and within a pattern that no human mind had been able to connect across the centuries. The question is no longer about who erected Stonehenge. The deeper question is what those ancient people understood that the world which came after them simply could not grasp. And trust me, as each layer continues to peel back, you will begin to feel that everything history has taught us until now may have been nothing more than the surface of a much deeper story. Out on England's Salisbury Plain, roughly 90 miles from London, there stretches an open field, and right at its center stand these enormous stones. From a distance, they appear to form a simple circle, but the moment you approach, you realize this is no ordinary structure. Those massive outer stones, known as sarsen stones, stand over 20 feet tall, and each one carries a weight of roughly 25 tons. Just let that sink in, 25 tons? And they were hauled here all the way from the Marlborough Downs, approximately 20 miles away. Now look inward. Inside you will find the comparatively smaller blue stones. They appear modest only because the outer stones are so towering. Even so, these inner stones can weigh as much as 4 tons apiece. And here's what makes it truly remarkable. Many of them are believed to have been transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of around 140 miles. Some more recent research even proposes that certain stones may not have originated in Wales at all, but somewhere even more distant, possibly Scotland. That would stretch the journey even further than we imagined. Now consider the timeline. This did not happen overnight. Stonehenge was raised across multiple phases, somewhere between around 3000 BCE and 2000 BCE. First came the earthwork ring and the surrounding ditch, then came the pits, and gradually those immense stones were set into place. Entire generations came and went, while the work carried on. And this is precisely where the real questions begin. Such extraordinary weight, such vast distances, such exact and precise arrangement, all achieved at a time when metal tools did not exist, wheeled transport was unknown, and cranes were centuries away. Even for highly skilled engineers working today, positioning stones of this scale with such accuracy is no simple task. So how on earth was any of this accomplished 5,000 years ago? This is the point where Stonehenge stops appearing simply beautiful and starts appearing genuinely impossible. The account we have long been given about Stonehenge goes roughly like this. It was constructed by Neolithic people, individuals using basic tools who labored across countless generations, for whom this site served as a religious or spiritual gathering place. According to this version, through dedication, patience, and shared effort, they raised this entire structure. They shaped the earth circle, dug out the pits, and steadily brought the stones in and positioned them. On the surface, this explanation feels entirely reasonable, simple, human, and easy to accept. But here is where a quiet complication enters. This account was not entirely wrong, but it was very likely incomplete, because when researchers began treating Stonehenge not merely as a physical site, but as a system of data, everything started shifting. This was not a process of a few short years. Over more than 300 years, every survey ever conducted, every measurement recorded, every archaeological report, geological study, and astronomical calculation was gathered and brought together for the very first time. Separate studies were brought together to form one bigger picture. And this is the point where AI enters the story, but it should not be imagined as some kind of magical machine. Think of it more like an extremely powerful engine for recognizing patterns, whose only job was to read every map, every survey, every alignment, and every anomaly together, and then check whether there was some hidden pattern that the human mind simply could not catch while looking at everything in isolated pieces. The instruction was straightforward enough. Nothing new needed to be created. No story needed to be invented. All that had to happen was that data, which already existed, needed to be read in a completely fresh way. And this is precisely where things began getting interesting. Because when centuries worth of data were placed side by side, certain connections started to emerge that had never been clearly visible before. Gradually, it began to feel like what we currently understand about Stonehenge might not be the complete picture. And this was the moment a question started forming. Have we actually been reading Stonehenge the wrong way this entire time? Aubrey holes, the first layer of the mystery. Now we arrive at that part of Stonehenge which people have been looking at for years without being able to make sense of it. The Aubrey holes. What exactly are they? In simple terms, just inside the outer earthen circle of Stonehenge, there sits a ring of 56 pits. These were documented in the 17th century by an English scholar by the name of John Aubrey, which is the reason they carry his name. Some of these pits held cremated human remains, some were found completely empty, and the purpose of some others still has not been clearly understood. So what had the story been saying up until now? That these pits were simply dug in a rough manner, and that the uneven spacing between them was nothing more than a result of the limitations people had back then. Basic tools, imprecise measurements, and a degree of human error. Put simply, the irregular spacing had always been treated as a mistake. But this is the point where the story takes a turn. When researchers carefully measured the distances between these 56 pits down to the millimeter and then plotted that data out, what emerged was entirely unexpected. These distances were not random at all. This was not some messy, imperfect circle. According to the AI analysis, when those distances were arranged as a sequence and graphed out, they began to resemble a wave pattern, something quite similar to a sine wave, meaning it rises and falls, but always follows a fixed rule. And this is where the truly mind-bending part begins. This pattern appeared to closely resemble the mathematical behavior found in the movement of the moon, specifically its 18.6-year nodal cycle. This is the cycle during which the moon's tilt or declination shifts continuously between its highest and lowest points. In certain years, it appears at its peak position in the sky, and in others, it sits at its lowest. Now just pause and think about this. If the spacing of the Aubrey holes actually represents this cycle, what does that tell us? It does not simply mean that they watched the moon. It means they observed its complete orbital behavior across a long stretch of time, genuinely understood it, and then encoded that understanding directly into the ground. And here is another point that makes things even more interesting. The number 56 itself may also carry a connection to this cycle. 18.6 multiplied by 3 gives approximately 55.8, which is remarkably close to 56. This suggests that the entire circle may have functioned as a kind of lunar calculator where people could stand and track the moon's position across many years. Whether this has been fully proven or not, the AI analysis suggests the idea is strong enough that it simply cannot be brushed aside. And this is the moment where something feels genuinely strange. What we had always assumed was a mistake. Could it actually have been deliberate encoding all along? Now the most compelling question surfaces. Why precisely 56? That does not feel like an accidental number. There has to be a reason behind it. If we bring it back to the moon's 18.6-year nodal cycle, something unusual shows up. Multiply 18.6 by 3 and the result is around 55.8, which is very close to 56. It is not a perfect match, but it is near enough that it becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. Think about it in a simple way. If a society was constructing a system like this, they were not just casually glancing up at the sky. They had been tracking every minor and major movement of the moon for years, possibly even decades, watching the sky each night, recording every shift, and eventually grasping the complete pattern. That is no simple feat, and the most remarkable thing is that this knowledge was not merely stored in someone's memory. It was laid out onto the Earth in a perfect circle, with carefully measured distances to represent the entire cycle. If that is the case, then those people were far more than laborers hauling stones from one place to another. They were observers who could read the heavens. They were measurers who kept every distance exact. They were planners whose thinking stretched decades into the future. And perhaps most significantly, they were symbolic engineers capable of transforming abstract understanding into a physical, lasting structure. From this point, Stonehenge starts to feel even more extraordinary because it no longer looks like a simple ring of rocks, but rather a living system designed to track and measure time. These massive sarsen stones are not placed randomly at all. They follow a deliberate pattern. Their height, their spacing, their angles, and the lintels resting across their tops all work together to create a closed, circular formation. For a long time, people saw this as nothing more than a structure. But when the full layout was examined through the lens of acoustic modeling, an entirely new perspective emerged. Certain research suggests that the shape of Stonehenge and the arrangement of its stones actually influence the behavior of sound, meaning that if you stand inside and produce a sound, whether clapping or speaking, it returns to you in an altered way. This is not a straightforward echo, but something much closer to a controlled reflection of sound waves. And here is where things take a genuinely surprising turn. According to analysis carried out using artificial intelligence, when Stonehenge was fully intact, with every stone properly positioned, it may have functioned as a kind of resonant cavity. In other words, a space where sound waves do not simply travel outward, but actually concentrate at specific points. This is where the concept of standing waves and low-frequency zones becomes relevant. There may have been particular spots where sound energy felt noticeably stronger, and other spots where it felt considerably weaker. Now, for perhaps the most fascinating detail of all, certain theories propose that if low-frequency sound, particularly in the infrasound range of around 95 to 120 Hz, was being produced, people might not have consciously heard it, yet they could have felt it physically throughout their bodies. Heartbeat, brain activity, emotional state, all of it could potentially have been influenced. This idea has not been fully confirmed, but if something along these lines was actually occurring, just consider what that implies. Stonehenge was not simply a place to look at, but a place to genuinely feel. Up to now, we have examined numbers, recognized patterns, and discussed sound. But the deeper question is only just beginning. What actual impact did any of this have on the people present? Inside Stonehenge and in the surrounding area, cremated human remains have been discovered across numerous locations. Burned bones and ash, found particularly within the Aubrey Holes, where several pits hold such remains. This makes it absolutely clear that the site was not purely a stone construction. It was also a place where final rites were carried out. But consider this. If the sole purpose of this location was cremation, then why such precise geometry, such an intricate design, and all of it executed on such an enormous scale, purely for ritual use? This is the point where the story becomes both personal and faintly unsettling. When acoustic modeling data and the recorded positions of human remains were examined alongside each other, a potential connection surfaced. Certain points where sound intensity may have been at its highest and where resonance could have been most concentrated happened to sit close to the locations where human remains were recovered. This connection remains unconfirmed, but if even a small portion of it holds truth, the implications are significant. It could suggest that Stonehenge was not a passive, silent temple where people simply arrived, completed their rituals, and departed. It may instead have been an experience machine, a space where standing within it made people feel something profoundly different. Perhaps during ceremonies involving sound, chanting, or drumming, an atmosphere was deliberately created in which a person's ordinary state of consciousness could shift. Something like a trance, a heightened emotional condition, or an experience that resists easy description in words. The most pressing, practical question now comes into focus. If Stonehenge's stones were transported from such enormous distances, then what was the reason? More importantly, why those particular stones? The blue stones positioned within the inner circle are widely thought to have originated from the Preseli Hills in Wales, roughly 240 kilometers away. Just pause and consider that for a moment. Hauling stones of that weight across such a distance using only the tools that existed back then. That alone is an extraordinary undertaking, so the question is straightforward enough. If all they needed were stones, plenty could have been sourced locally. Why go to such extreme lengths? This is exactly where the concept of ringing stones enters the picture. Certain researchers discovered that a number of stones from the Preseli Hills produce a crisp, resonant tone when struck together, almost like a bell or a metallic ring. In other words, these are far more than ordinary rocks. They are capable of generating sound. Now connect that to the acoustic discussion from earlier. If Stonehenge functioned as a kind of resonant structure, then the tonal properties of its interior stones become critically important. According to AI-based analysis, these blue stones were not selected by chance, but were deliberately chosen for their acoustic qualities. Each stone was capable of producing a distinct tone, and when arranged in a particular configuration, they could collectively create something resembling a harmonic system, similar to how individual musical notes combine to form a complete scale. This theory has not been fully confirmed yet, but it is a genuinely fascinating one. Consider a present-day comparison. In modern concert halls, acoustic engineers make precise decisions about which materials go where, so that sound travels and bounces correctly and every member of the audience hears it at its best. If that same logic was applied at Stonehenge, it means the site was not merely a collection of upright stones. It was a deliberately engineered sound environment. And Stonehenge did not exist in isolation. The entire surrounding landscape was part of the design. Now picture yourself not standing on the ground, but observing this whole region from far above. Only from that vantage point does the full picture reveal itself. Stonehenge is not a solitary monument. It sits at the heart of a far greater pattern. Stretching outward across several kilometers in every direction, there is an entire landscape composed of earthwork circles, burial mounds, long, straight processional routes, timber circles, and numerous other features that might seem unrelated at first glance. But viewed together, they reveal a clear geometry. Modern technologies, including LiDAR scanning, geophysical mapping, and multi-site analysis, have illuminated this entire region in a way that looks remarkably like someone drafted a detailed plan from above and then executed it across the terrain. In certain areas, burial mounds are positioned so precisely that they form perfect triangles, with Stonehenge serving as the central reference point between them. Some pathways extend in perfectly straight lines across kilometers of open land. Various structures are oriented in specific directions, as though deliberately marking particular celestial or seasonal events. And this leads to perhaps the most significant realization of all. The real mystery was never contained within those standing stones alone. It was woven across the entire landscape. UNESCO and English Heritage both now acknowledge that Stonehenge is not a standalone monument, but belongs to a broader prehistoric landscape. A connected system in which every structure, every mound, and every alignment forms part of something larger. Viewed through that lens, Stonehenge does not seem any less remarkable. If anything, it becomes even more significant because it is no longer just a place. It is the focal point of an entire coordinated vision. For a long time, people assumed Stonehenge came first, and everything else grew up around it afterward. But when the full landscape was examined as one connected whole, an entirely different story emerged. Certain earthworks, burial mounds, and older markings actually predate the Sarsen stones. This means the great stone circle visible today was not the starting point. It may well have been the final element placed within a plan that had long existed, and that points to one unavoidable conclusion. The blueprint existed first, and the stones were set in place to fulfill it. Think carefully about what that means. If a design was already established long in advance, then those who created it were not building for their own generation alone. This was never the work of a single lifetime. It went on for hundreds of years, perhaps 500, maybe even 1,000. And that raises the biggest question of all. How exactly did this knowledge manage to survive across such a vast stretch of time? Were there written records that have since disappeared? Or was everything handed down through oral tradition, each generation passing precise knowledge to the next with complete accuracy? Perhaps there were specific individuals, ritual specialists, who carried the full understanding of this system and kept it alive. And the most fascinating thing is this. Was all of it held purely within memory, or did they have some kind of method that allowed geometry and alignment to be reproduced with perfect consistency, even without anything written down? Because what we're looking at here is not random or accidental development. It feels like an inherited blueprint, as though someone designed the whole system right from the start, and every generation that followed was simply working to bring it to completion. And from that realization, another one follows. Maybe Stonehenge was never the beginning of a civilization at all, but rather the final echo of its knowledge. Even when the individual construction phases were examined closely, a strange pattern emerged. The earliest layouts, whether the placement of the blue stones or the positioning of the sarsen trilithons, were actually more precise. Their alignment, their spacing, their symmetry, all of it appears sharper and more accurate in the beginning. But as time moved forward, that precision began to slowly fade. The later rearrangements simply do not carry the same perfect balance. Some stones sit at slightly wrong angles. Some alignments are not nearly as clean as they once were. According to the data laid out in the source material, the early stones had an average deviation of around 3.22 centimeters. That is almost flawless. But in the later phases, that deviation grows to approximately 12.7 centimeters. Now, that gap might sound small, but within a structure this large and this complex, it matters enormously. And it is not just the numbers that tell this story. The stones themselves carry the evidence. On certain stones, you can see different types of tool marks, as though varying techniques were applied at different points in time, sometimes on the very same stone. In certain areas, shaping was left unfinished, only to be returned to years later using an entirely different approach. In some spots, it genuinely feels as though the builders were attempting to understand what had come before them, but were simply unable to fully replicate it. And this is where the most emotionally resonant point arrives. When a society is learning and developing, its skill level tends to rise over time. But here, the opposite is unfolding. That could mean the later generations were not building something new at all. They were only trying to preserve something older. They never walked away from the pattern, but they gradually lost their complete grasp of it. It is as if someone created a perfectly calibrated system at the very beginning, and the people who came after kept attempting to reproduce it without truly understanding what made it so precise. From that point on, Stonehenge no longer feels like a construction project. It feels like a memory that is slowly dissolving, a body of knowledge that was once fully understood, but grew dimmer and more blurred with every passing generation. So what was Stonehenge, and why was it ultimately abandoned? When you bring all of these threads together, the image of the place transforms entirely. The Aubrey holes, which once seemed like nothing more than simple pits, now appear to encode a full lunar cycle, a pattern of 56 tied to the 18.6-year cycle, functioning as a tracking system capable of running across decades. The stone circle, which once looked like just a ring of standing stones, now reads as an acoustic structure designed to shape and control sound. And the inner blue stones, carried from so far away, no longer seem like ordinary stones. They look like elements deliberately chosen for their acoustic properties. Then when you pull back and take in the wider landscape, the earthworks, the burial mounds, the long pathways, the geometric alignments, it becomes impossible to see Stonehenge as a standalone monument. It was part of something much larger, a design distributed across the land that perhaps can only be fully grasped when viewed from high above. And then comes the most striking detail of all, that gradual decline in accuracy over time. That tells us this system was not growing or evolving. It was slowly slipping away. Those who lived in the earliest period, with complete understanding, almost certainly knew precisely what they were constructing. But the generations that followed, were simply trying to maintain the pattern without truly grasping its deeper meaning. Now comes the final question. If all of this mattered so deeply, then why was the place eventually abandoned? Somewhere around 1600 BCE, activity at Stonehenge starts to noticeably fall away. But this abandonment does not resemble the typical way a site gets left behind. Certain stones were gently laid flat upon the earth. Certain sections were intentionally covered over, not as though something was being hidden, but rather as though it was being kept safe. It gives the feeling that they understood they could no longer sustain this system, yet at the same time, they were unwilling to let it vanish entirely. And from that point, a completely different possibility starts to take shape. Perhaps Stonehenge was never a temple, never simply a site of worship. Perhaps it was not even a machine in the sense that we use that word today. And perhaps it was not purely an observatory either. Perhaps it was one unified, integrated system where the rhythms of the heavens, the resonance of sound, human ritual, the marking of time, and collective memory were all woven together into a single whole. Even now, mainstream archaeology describes Stonehenge as a prehistoric ceremonial landscape, a place where many different kinds of human activity once occurred. But when you step back and consider the full picture at once, an entirely different reading begins to come forward. A reading where Stonehenge was not a starting point, but a last effort, an attempt to lock disappearing knowledge inside stone, as though a civilization sensed its wisdom slipping through its fingers and chose to encode it into the most enduring, most permanent material available, so that some future generation, at some unknown point in time, might one day find a way to read it again. And perhaps right now, after so many thousands of years, we are making that first real attempt to decode it. Because the true question was never about who built Stonehenge. The true question has always been what they were so desperately trying to preserve. If this video resonated with you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this one.